We're going to be in the book of Romans, the epistle to the church at Rome. And what the epistle to the church at Rome was, Paul was essentially writing to them, soliciting their financial support, and the entire epistle is an outline of what he, that is, he as an apostle, taught on his missionary and evangelistic tours. And he wanted them to be comfortable with what he taught. So that's really what the epistle to the Romans really is. But it just doesn't speak to that church 2,000 years ago. It speaks to all of us today, Christians in all and in any ages. We're going to read for our scripture for today, our main scripture, Romans 8, verse 28. One of the most read scriptures, one of the most availed of scriptures. It says, all things work for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now, that's a very often quoted scripture. But it says that God works for our good, not our comfort. You see, God works for all of our good in whatever conditions, circumstances we may find ourselves in, but he's not working for our comfort and or our enjoyment. That is, that he can work salvation and redemption in whatever you face. Whatever it is that you and I may be going through, God can work in the midst of it for your good. In each of our lives, there are painful circumstances that come our way, often injustices, many different kinds of obstacles and problems. There is the loss of occupations, friendship, health, wealth. There's the loss of status. There's a loss of many things, even the loss of freedom. Yet in the midst of all of it, whatever it is that you and I may be facing, God can work in the midst of all of it for your good. The point is that God can bring to pass good in the midst of difficult and horrendous circumstances. That is, those things which were intended or meant for our harm, God may mean for our good. We can look at the life of the patriarch Joseph. He had received from God, through dreams, assurances that he, Joseph, one of the youngest of Jacob's sons, that he would have a place of prominence, not just among his family, but that his life would have an impact far beyond the scope of his generation. Yet in the midst of receiving all those promises, his brothers, his older brothers, through resentment and envy and jealousy, threw him in a pit and then sold him into Egyptian slavery. We find that his brothers were motivated by jealousy and greed, and often they acted spitefully against him because he was Jacob's favorite son. Joseph was taken to Egypt, where he found himself a slave, and there he was accused of inappropriate behavior. He was removed from justice and placed in a prison. There he stayed for many years without any hope. And yet God ultimately, in the midst of it, worked for Joseph's good. And ultimately, by working in the life of Joseph, he preserved the promise of a Messiah and all the blessings that God had passed to his family. That is, that through God working in the life of the patriarch Joseph 3,500 years ago, we today are blessed because through his family came the Messiah. And the life of Joseph's family was preserved. And each one of us here today are the recipients of the blessings that God bestowed upon them and maintained even when Joseph was in the midst of circumstances that were very difficult. We can read of the life of Joseph in Genesis 50 to verse 20, or chapter 20. And then after the death of Jacob, that is the father of Joseph, Joseph's brothers feared that Joseph would move vengefully. That would move against them. He would recall the mistreatment and the injustice that had been shown them in their lives, and they feared that he would act against them. Yet Joseph perceived and recognized God's mercy and grace in his providential hand, even in the midst of the hardships that he went through. And Joseph gathered his brothers together, and he spoke these words in Genesis 50, verse 20. What you meant for harm, God intended for good. What you meant for harm, God intended for good. That is, that God worked redemption in the midst of all that Joseph suffered, all that he was dealing with. You see, he perceived God's hand was there. He recognized that God's purpose was being worked out in his life, even through the difficulties that he encountered. That God was there and redeemed every moment for his purpose. We, however, we may go through difficulties And we may not always recognize the providence of God. We may not always understand what it is that God is doing in our lives. We face hardships. We face difficulties, injustices. There are circumstances, there are things that happen to us that we just don't understand why they are taking place. Whatever they might be, whether it's the loss of a relationship, loss of a job, health, whatever it is, there are times we just don't understand why those things are happening to us. And we wonder, where is God in all of it? Where is God when I suffer? Where is God when I need Him the most? Where is God when my health fails me, when my finances are depleted? Where is God when I lose my job? Where is God when I lose a loved one? Where is God in the midst of all of it? Yet the same God that worked in the life of Joseph can work in each one of our lives. And in the midst of all the difficulties and challenges, He can work redemption for you. That all things work for the good. Again, they don't work for our comfort. They work for our good. That there are things that we learn in the midst of hardship, trials, difficulties, and uncertainty that we can never learn any other way. How would you, how would I, how would we ever know that we needed God if things were always good? How would we know that we needed Him if we didn't have occasion to cry out to Him, to call to Him, to look to Him? It's easy when things are good. But what about when things are bad, when there are challenges in our lives? That's where we know He is there the most, when we are facing challenges. We can look even in the Old Testament book of Lamentations. And Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah. It's a poetic first-hand account of the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. The people of Israel were besieged on every side. Hardship befell them. The very temple, the heart of Israel's relationship with the Creator God, had been destroyed. The people turned even to acts of violence and self-preservation that would astound us even today. And in the midst of all of it, Jeremiah came to recognize the presence and the providence of God in the midst of the hardships. In Lamentations 3, verse 55, Jeremiah writes, "My enemies chase me sore like a bird without a cause." How many times have we felt that we were chased sore? Where the problems become so repetitive and so long in duration that we feel that we have been chased sore. We get tired. We get frustrated. We feel that we can't go on anymore, and especially when these things come into our life without cause. We don't understand why they're happening. It's because of no fault of our own. We don't understand why these things are occurring to us, yet they are there. Jeremiah continues to write, "They have cut off my life in the pit and have cast a stone upon me." You see, he was cast down literally into a pit, very much like Joseph was, and a stone was cast upon it. That is, the pit was sealed. And there at the lowest point, in the height of his difficulty, at the darkest moment, where he felt that a stone was between he and God, where his prayers were going unheeded, that God was not paying attention. In the midst of that, at his lowest point, he writes, "Waters flowed over my head. Then I said, I am cut off." He says, I don't have any more answers. There's no way out. There's no way forward. There's nothing that I can do to extradite myself out of this circumstances. There are no answers. He was at his lowest point. His nation had just been destroyed. The capital city sacked. The king taken into captivity. The temple of God decimated. He is at his lowest point. And he feels cut off, isolated, alone, without help. There's no person to come to his aid. There's no one who can be with him. He is alone and at the lowest point. Then he said, I called upon your name, O Lord, out of the lowest pit. You have heard my voice. Do not hide your ear from my breathing and my cry. Then he writes, you drew near in the day that I called on you. You drew near and you said, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid is the most often repeated admonition in all of Scripture. From Genesis to Revelation, the Scriptures speak to us that we should not fear. You see, the truth was Jeremiah was never alone. God was with him even at the lowest point, when things seemed at their worst, when things seemed helpless, when there seemed to be no answers, when there was no way forward. He felt that his prayers were going unheeded, yet God did hear them. God did act. And God let Jeremiah know that he was there with him even in the midst of it. That same God will be with us in the midst